If you can't be bothered to watch this entire video, I've linked an image of the entire build in the description below. Since my last build video, I've slightly altered my primary builds, and I feel as if the original video covering my builds was of lower quality than what I'm capable of creating, most obviously shown by its unscripted nature and the lack of sufficient explanations for the choices made within the build. This video hopes to rectify that. The primary build I most use is a 4K stamina commanding striker. The goal of this build and its derivatives is to complete the legendary and endgame content as quickly as possible, meaning lowering the time to kill enemies takes precedent. As half the name implies, the core of the build is a 6-piece classified striker. Since you're watching a more advanced build video, I'm going to assume you know how classified striker works, but if you don't, the brief summary is that when you hit a shot on an enemy, you get 2 stacks. Stacks degrade over time and when you miss shots. Each stack gives you a slight damage increase, plus some healing over time that scales with stamina. Meaning, when you have max stacks 100, you do significantly increased damage. This set also increases your stability, which is your recoil control and your enemy armor damage, making it by far the best solo build for PvE content in the game. In order to most take advantage of the strengths of Striker while most lowering the time to kill enemies, we employ the Tactical Link Signature skill, also known as the Yellow Ultimate. This ability greatly increases weapon damage per second as well as gun handling, with the caveat of only lasting 13 seconds and having a cooldown in the minutes. For a speedrun that's simply too long and too short, meaning we have to find a way to extend the duration of attack link as well as lower its cooldown. Which brings us to the weapons, their talents being the way in which we achieve that goal. The primary weapon I use is an LVOAC assault rifle. Assault rifles provide high DPS with their inherent bonus damage to enemy armor, while also being accurate at range and controllable up close. The LVOAC and M4 specifically both share the spot for the highest DPS assault rifle in the game, with their primary difference being their recoil control. The LVOAC has much greater vertical muzzle climb, while the M4 has less vertical climb, but also has side-to-side recoil. This means the LVOAC is harder to control, but puts the responsibility of hitting shots onto the players rather than the luck of side-to-side recoil. However, in further distance engagements, the M4 will be more controllable than the LVOAC. With all that being said, the M4 can be crafted, while the LVOAC can only be world dropped, meaning the M4 is a perfectly fine stopgap if you can't get an LVOAC with the correct talents. Speaking of talents, what is rolled on my guns? On my LVOAC, I have Competent, Commanding, and Determined, while on my M4, I have Responsive, Commanding, and Determined. The two most important talents are by far Commanding and Determined, and unlocking them is one of the reasons for the seemingly odd main stat distribution, which we'll get back to in a minute. Commanding makes any kill performed while your signature ability is active extend its duration by 20%. 20% may not seem like a lot, but when you start chaining kills together, you can get minute-long ultimates. To then minimize the downtime between the ults, we have Determined. Determined makes it so any kill you get will reduce all skill cooldowns by 7.5%. Since we now have longer ults, where we're securing many kills, we're now also greatly reducing the downtime between ults. Sometimes even to the point where the only thing stopping another immediate ult is the forced cooldown between multiple of the same ult. Something to note is Determined placement in the third and bottom talent slot. This talent slot removes the main stat requirements for a talent, meaning whatever is there will always be unlocked. While the increase in electronics for commanding can be justified, the same can't be said for Determined's much steeper electronic requirements, meaning it must be in that third slot for this build to work. The other two talents on my weapons are simple damage buffs. I now use Competent on my primary as it gives a slight damage buff shortly after using skills. I understand Competent is an additive and not multiplicative damage buff, meaning when it's combined with Striker stacks, it may not actually do that much, but it's better than the alternatives that either won't ever proc or be even lower damage. On the M4 side, we have Responsive. Responsive is one of the 3 multiplicative weapon talents, meaning it's one of the best damage perks in the entire game. I therefore use the M4 in close quarters combat with enemies as its bonus is much more effective than Competence. If you don't understand what I mean when I say multiplicative versus additive damage bonuses, I recommend you watch this Marco style video, which I've linked below. Now that the weapon talents are covered, let's move on to their attachments. While in PvP, burst damage and critical hit chance and damage are king, in PvE, sustained damage and headshot based damage are much better. Because of how the crit damage and headshot damage are calculated together, it's best to lean into one of the two more heavily. And since NPCs are much easier to hit when compared to actual players, headshot damage will always outpace a crit build. This means we have headshot-based attachments with our optic and muzzle, a VX1 scope, and Omega rifle suppressor respectively. For both, you ideally want 18.5% headshot damage, 3% critical hit chance, and then your choice of either critical hit damage, accuracy, or optimal range. It's mostly personal preference with such small bonuses. For the magazine, you want an extended magazine with 121% ammo capacity, 3% critical hit chance, and 5.6% fire rate. This is the best magazine configuration for 99% of the builds in the game, the only real exception being Lone Star. Finally, for the underbarrel attachment, you want a hand stop with 31% reload speed, 4% critical hit damage, and your choice for the rest. As previously stated, sustained damage is the key to PvE content, meaning the combination of the hand stop's reload speed and the extra ammo from the extended mag results in more time spent actually firing at enemies instead of just reloading. For a detailed breakdown on what can roll in weapon attachments as well as their min and max rolls, consult the spreadsheet I've linked below. We can finally move on to the gear itself. Immediately, we can see the seemingly odd main stat distribution. Intuitively, you'd think that with the goal of killing enemies as fast as possible, everything should be dumped into firearms, with the other two being at 2.9k the minimum, but that's not actually optimal. First, as previously mentioned, the weapon talent commanding requires some electronics, so the build has just enough electronics to reach its threshold. Secondly, we have about 4k stamina because of how diminishing return works. We increase our stamina by 1k from its minimum of 2.9k. That jump from 2.9 to 4k is more than a 25% increase in our stamina. Comparatively, increasing our firearms from 7.7k to 8.7k is only a 12% increase. Of course, there's a lot more math that goes into effective health and damage, but the core principle of diminishing return stays true through all of it. That 1k worth of main stats is better spent increasing our stamina than it is increasing our damage, especially when we already have so many other ways to increase our damage. In order to actually achieve this stat distribution, we have 4 pieces of gear rolled for firearms, 1 for stamina, and all of our gear mods are electronics, with the holster always being rolled for all 3 main stats. What piece has what main stat roll doesn't really matter as long as the totals are correct. With that covered, let's go over what rolls I have on each piece and what gear mod / performance mod I have, starting with the mask. On the mask, I have 4% critical hit chance as my major attribute, and 12% damage to elites as my secondary attribute. I then have a purple electronics mod as my gear mod. While purple gear mods give less main stats than their high-end counterparts, they more than make up for it by being able to roll with some completely different attributes. In this case, we have 4% damage to elites rolled on them. This is the max it can roll, and you'll come to see that stacking enemy armor damage and damage to elites is a priority for us. For the vest, the major attributes are 5% health on kill and 6% enemy armor damage. While you can roll health in the chest piece, I feel as if health on kill is more valuable. As you're getting so many kills in rapid succession, you can quickly heal with the health on kill, and that's much more valuable than a raw health increase. However, you could swap the small amount of enemy armor damage for health if preferred. The minor attribute is then 56% ammo capacity. Additionally, there are 2 purple electronic gear mods, both with 4% damage to elites. On the backpack, the major attribute is 17.5% stability. Similar to the vest, you could reroll this for health, but I find the stability useful during longer bursts, especially with the LVO AC. The minor attribute is then again 56% ammo capacity. This ammo buff combined with the one of the chest piece is the perfect spot for total ammo capacity. There's really only 2 places in any of my speedruns I do where ammo gets even close to tight, so this amount of ammo is more than enough for a majority of the game's content. There's yet again 1 more electronics gear mod with 4% damage to elites. And on top of that, there's 2 performance mods, both of which are 6% sticky bombs range. This allows for a greater number of enemies to be flashed, synergizing well with our constant tactical link. However, if you're having trouble surviving, I recommend self-heal performance mods instead. The gloves have 8% enemy armor damage, 6% critical hit chance, and 12% assault rifle damage. In most situations, you'd want to have the armor damage rolled for critical hit damage instead, but because the critical hit chance on this build is so low, it's better to get the constant armor damage. The other 2 rolls are simply best in slot for a DPS build. On the holster, we have 22% reload speed. As mentioned in the gun section, minimizing reload time is key, and this is the best way to do that. For the performance mods, there's another sticky bomb range mod. Finally, there's the knee pads. The main attribute is a health roll. The other DPS options are all so low, making their diminishing return even worse, thereby leaving the health roll as the only real option. For the minor attributes, it's 33% disrupt resistance, 33% shock resistance, and 16% damage to elites. While the damage to elite roll may be obvious, the other two might not be. Shock is the only status effect in the game you can't use a medkit during, meaning having a resistance to it is the only way to reduce its effect. For the disrupt, when fighting hunters and rogue boss agents, they often send out disruption pulses. While I mostly try to endure them with medkit and energy bar usage, sometimes they happen back to back while a medkit or consumable is on cooldown, leaving the disrupt resistance as a backup. The skills the build runs are the tactical link, as discussed, a flashbang sticky grenade to stun enemies and draw them out of cover, and the tactical scanner pulse. The pulse is vital for situational awareness, with the tactical scanner pulse being by far the best pulse for solo DPS use. On top of its bonuses to critical hit chance and critical hit damage, it also gives 5% multiplicative damage bonus to every target that's scanned. For agent talents, there's only 6 or 7 good ones in the game, leaving the choice pretty easy. It's on the move, one is none, critical save, and your choice between tech support, adrenaline, and strike back. On the move grants a damage resistance bonus every time you get a kill while moving. This is something you should pretty much always be proccing by slowly walking left or right when you're about to finish off an enemy. One is none gives the player a 50% chance to not consume bullets when hitting headshots. This majorly helps with sustained DPS, especially against tankier enemies like heavies or hunters. Critical save gives bonus damage resistance when you use a medkit at low health. Generally, in speedruns, you should only use a medkit when you really have to, and in that case you'll get the damage resistance from critical save when you need it the most. Finally, for your choice you have tech support, which will extend the duration enemies are pulsed when you get a kill, adrenaline, which grants 7 seconds of status effect immunity when using a medkit, and strike back, which grants the player skill haste when they're at low health. I personally switch between tech support and adrenaline depending on the mission, but I can see any of the three being a valid choice depending on your playstyle or skill level. I didn't cover the pistol earlier because if you need it during most of the runs, something has gone horribly wrong, but it still provides great utility. While determined lower skills with kills, Cool-Headed, the most important perk on your pistol, can lower skill cooldowns just by hitting headshots. You can take advantage of this by shooting the dummy at the base of operations in the head with the pistol repeatedly to get back your ult in between runs if there's no ads around the mission you're playing. This can be done with any build, but with builds that have lower electronics, it's best to get a low-level pistol with Cool-Headed, thereby reducing its requirements. There are 2 derivatives of this build I also use. A 6k stamina build and a skill haste build that I use on Times Square Power Relay and General Assembly respectively. The 6k stamina is built pretty much the same way, this time with a distribution of 3 stamina rolled pieces, 1 firearms, and 1 rolled in electronics, with 4 stamina damage to elite gear mods and 1 firearms damage to elite mod to just barely hit the 6k stamina mark needed for extra regen from the striker stacks. This build also has a different pistol that actually matters, and it's used during the fuse box section. The best pistol DPS wise is the X45. While the 93R theoretically has higher DPS, it's practically unusable. For the X45's talents, it has Cool-Headed and Unforgiving. Because of how much fire you take during the fuse box section, you can reliably proc Unforgiving while also getting your ult back with Cool-Headed. For attachments, it has a crit hit damage muzzle, accuracy underbarrel, the only option for a pistol, and an extended mag, all with similar secondary roles as the primaries. The other derivative of this build is one for General Assembly. General Assembly has a lot of areas that can be bottlenecked by your skill cooldowns, meaning a bit of extra skill haste is required. Therefore, the only gear change from the base 4k stamina build is the chest piece. It now has skill haste in the place of enemy armor damage while maintaining the health on kill. Additionally, the build has tear gas secret mines instead of a tactical pulse. This is for the first combat area, which I skip. It briefly stuns the enemies in the room while I go for a wall clip. This skill then gets swapped back to a pulse immediately afterwards. On top of that, the Lone Star build used at the end of General Assembly is very similar in roles except to the Striker build. Except with some health and enemy armor damage rolls being switched to critical hit based ones, as you can't really headshot a helicopter. The MG5s, their respective best in class, then have Prepared, Deadly, and Destructive with crit hit damage attachments and a heavy magazine spring. With Lone Star, you want to proc the Lone Star buff by reaching the end of a belt as fast as possible, meaning a high fire rate with less magazine size is actually better here. The build then has a tactical pulse, a tactical link, which I can never generate by the time I switch to this build, and a booster shot first aid, which grants a bit of extra damage. That should be everything you need to know to make a commanding striker build of your own, but if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments, and I'll be sure to answer them.